use it here?
Yeah, let's put it here to start, then we can move it around.
Okay.
Thank you, Father Paul. I appreciate that. And welcome to everyone for at least looking at some of the key elements of this remarkable encyclical. In my teaching in CCD, seniors, and adult education, again for 27 years at my former parish, encyclicals were one of the things that I really enjoyed, and read them and studied them and taught from them, especially the social encyclicals, of which this is one. I can say that in studying this one for almost a year now, I've never really seen anything that has so many levels of study that are possible. One can study it at the scientific level, you can study at the practical level, very practical, the spiritual level, and a deep theological level. And the interesting thing about the encyclical is all of those levels are interchanged. Pope Francis has managed to do that. And sometimes I would just call him Francis because he's Pope Francis. In looking at this particular encyclical, it's a long one, 45,000 words, 80 pages. And it is one that does require much more study than we could devote to it, obviously, tonight. This will be looking at some of the key elements. But in the encyclical itself, we can recognize that there are two operative words that bind together the messages. And there are 246 paragraphs in this encyclical. And the messages are many, but the two operative words are interrelatedness and interdependency. If there's anything that binds the messages together in the encyclical, it's those two operational words. So we're going to have a look at this. It's long, and what I've done here is when I talked to Sharon Donahue, and now we have a new director of our social justice, the intent was to have a year-long discussion of Laudato Si. And I still would like to do that. We tried to make that goal, but it just didn't work. And so Father Paul suggested that we in fact start with an hour's presentation. And Sharon and I worked with that. She did a wonderful job in putting together the ads in the bulletin. And I have to acknowledge my collaborator of all of my presentations, Barbara Shoemaker, back in the back, because without her and some of her technical abilities and use of the illustrations that she finds, all of these presentations I don't think would be quite as interesting. And she's also a biologist, so that helps. We have a tie-in there. So we'll start by looking at key elements and then talk about the structure and the messages as we go through. And I think that this will actually launch us into the key parts of the encyclical. First, the purpose. What did Pope Francis hope to do? He told us right off. It's his hope that it would add to the body of the Church's social teaching and help us acknowledge, and this is so important because he feels deeply about this, the appeal, immensity, and urgency of the challenge that we face. So he really hopes then that it's going to be added to the compendium of the social doctrine of the Church, which we have in its entirety. And in knowing the compendium, it is a major addition. Now this foundation, how does he start? What does he use as a foundation? And here he departs from other popes and their encyclicals, which generally start with a theological foundation or a spiritual foundation and then build out. Pope John Paul, St. John Paul II, used that particular format to bring in the relationship between science and faith. Francis doesn't do that. He begins by reviewing several aspects of the present ecological crisis. He wants to draw on the results of the best scientific research available today, touches deeply, and they provide the concrete foundation for the ethical and spiritual itinerary that follows, not the other way around. Because he feels that this other way of reaching the truth, which is through reason and science, has to lay the foundation to really understand the crisis. So he departs there, and it's an important departure. If we look at the next slide here, we see what his inspiration was. And it's obvious. It's from his namesake, St. Francis of Assisi, the example par excellence of care for the vulnerable, patron saint of all of those who work in the area of ecology. I'm comforted by that. I like that. But he also pointed out that St. Francis, associated with creation and the creatures, really was concerned with more than that. For the poor and the outcast. And the important thing about it, this interrelatedness and interdependency, is in that last few lines. He shows us how inseparable the bond is for nature, justice for the poor, commitment to society, and interior peace. That was St. Francis's real message. And this is also the message of Francis. Well, I can see right now that I'm going to have to deal with this, Barbara, in another way. And why did he choose ecology? Pope Francis, you know, is a chemist. He's a scientist. He understands science very well. He also works very well with the Pontifical Academy of Science, where he draws these experts in. His science is very solid. He chose ecology rather than biology and cosmogenesis and astrophysics and physics and so on for a reason. Because ecology is that branch of science that studies the relationships, again, interrelationships, between living organisms and the environment which they develop. It comes from the work of the German scientist Ernst Haeckel, German ecology, but from the Greek, oikos, which means home, and logos, which means the study of the home. And of course, that is Pope Francis's title, subtitle, Care for Our Common Home. So there is a reason then for ecology, not just in that, but also in the fact that it's a synthesis of all of the other branches of science. Biology, genetics, climatology, physics, mathematics. And the Pope warns against the fragmentation of taking just biology or just climatology, which has gotten a lot of people in trouble because of climate change. These separate because it's a fragmentation. Ecology brings it together. And that's the important message that he wants to do. The other thing, he continually links this to the authentic teachings of the Church, the Magisterium. And you'll see all through the encyclical references from the Catholic Catechism. And this is a key one. And I should point out that when we do this as a year-long discussion, we'll have long discussions on each one of these pieces. But each one of these references, 138 and so on, come from the references in the encyclical itself. So these appear so that the readers can see exactly where in the encyclical they lie. But here's where he draws on the catechism. The catechism tells us that God wills the interdependence of creatures. Creatures exist only in dependence to one another, to complete each other in the service of each other. That's the core thing with ecology. And the catechism is very much ecologically oriented, which sometimes I think may surprise some people. So we see in ecology that you can go all the way from an individual, a population of individuals, like in this case elks, then the community that the elk lives in, but more importantly the ecosystem, the system of a shared environment, a shared group of interrelated and interdependent animals, plants, microorganisms, and climate. All together constitute an ecosystem. All the ecosystems are together in certain regions of the earth called a biome. That's the Arctic biome up there. And then all are grouped together in the living web of life on the earth called the biosphere. And we're used to ecological terms showing that you start with plants, which is a source of all energy through photosynthesis, go to the ones that eat the plants, called herbivores, then the mice, the carnivore, eats the herbivore, and then the carnivore eats that carnivore, and then there's a top carnivore. We're a top carnivore if we go all the way through cattle from grass and so on. And then a web would show how intricate and how interrelated these animals within an ecosystem would be. So, what is his theme? He's talking about Sister Mother Earth. And where does he get that inspiration? Well, you do have in the handout St. Francis's Canticle of the Creatures. And this is where he gets his inspiration, not only from St. Francis, in his care for the poor and the environment and creatures, but from the canticle itself. In the handout, you will see that Pope Francis doesn't entitle his encyclical, as the other popes have done, in Latin, like Fides et Ratio of John Paul II. But he actually uses the actual language and dialect of St. Francis. St. Francis wrote this canticle in 1225, early 13th century. And he wrote it in the Italian, but in the Umbrian dialect. So in the Umbrian dialect, the first verse, which starts his encyclical, is Laudate Si, mi Signore, per sora nostra Madre Terra, which is easy to understand. And then he goes on to talk about who sustains us, governs us, and who produces varied fruits and colored flowers and herbs. But the encyclical also praises God through more than Sister Mother Earth. He offers praise to the Lord through Brother Sun, Sister Moon, Brother Wind, Sister Water, Brother Fire. And it's very interesting from the science standpoint, because these are the very elements that function in an ecosystem. There must be water. There must be Sister Moon, Brother Wind. Wind actually drives plants in many ways in the physiology of plants. Each one of his canticle, his praises to the Lord, are through something that drives ecosystems. So again, it's the spiritual coming together with the scientific, and later we'll see coming together with the theological, which is the most difficult part of Francis's encyclical. And it goes beyond the scientific study of this to what Francis calls his integral ecology. Because he's going to talk about a relationship, an interrelationship, and interdependency of not just creatures and the soil and the water and the climate and the sun, but with humans. So he was saying that in this aspect of a global crisis, ecology must respect human and social dimensions. This is how he ties it in to the social teachings of the church. And then he points out that everything is related. The physical, the geological, the chemical, the biological, all are interrelated. It's not just creatures and living organisms. It's the non-living as well that are interrelated and interdependent. And so we recognize this in ecology, that you can't just deal with the living, but the non-living as well. And he indicates here that we speak of the environment, and he points out throughout that nature cannot be regarded as separate from us in a mere setting, but we're part of nature, included in it, constant interaction with it, and recognizing that a given area requires working society, economy, behavior, and all of this. So he's saying that too often, we as humans have said, we're going to deal with nature, or we're going to modify nature, or we're going to use nature to our advantage. We're going to farm, and nature is out here, and we're humans, and we're there. And we have this relationship. Francis is saying no, not in an integral ecology. And the scientists know it's no as well. We are in constant interaction with everything from the climate, the air we breathe, everything that we deal in nature, the microorganisms in our digestive system, the microorganisms in plants and animals that web out throughout the biosphere. So that he continues to go with this theme. And we can see a number of examples here. One before that I think we showed. Have we shown yet the bee? We'll have to look at that. But what he does after this long introduction, he divides the encyclical into 6 chapters. Each chapter then showing the crisis due to human interactions in an integral way, but then weaves in this other level, the spiritual level and the theological. The spiritual level is relatively easy to handle because it's inspirational. The theological level is very difficult for an encyclical. And too often people have, as Father Paul read out, a third of Catholics and some, low numbers. They really haven't studied or much less even read the encyclical to look at this depth, because it's certainly there. So he takes us there in each of these chapters. Chapter 1, which is heavily scientifically based, because he promised to start with the foundation of science. What is happening to our common home? In the words of the Umbria, it would be Sora Nostrum, Matre Terra. Our sister, Mother Earth. What's happening? And he goes on to point out in typical Francis fashion, and he's not typical, but in his fashion, that theological and philosophical reflections can sound tiresome and abstract unless they're grounded into analysis of the situation today, in many ways unprecedented in the history of humanity. A common theme that he weaves through here is that our science and technology in the last 100 years have taken us to a place that humankind has never been before. We're in a different plane of existence, and we truly are. And he develops that different plane and tells us what we've gotten ourselves into by engaging in it. So he's going to turn to what's happening to our home. But he points out again, technological changes occurring so rapidly that they're not necessarily geared to the common good and sustainable human development. That theme percolates through the encyclical, pops up, and is reinforced by a lot of wonderful literature. So what examples does Francis give us? All right, millions of tons of dangerous waste generated from homes, medical, industrial. One of my first projects was in Doe Run, Kentucky, not far from Louisville. It was a year-long study in 1964, I guess 52 years ago, not very long ago. And we followed the tracing of the dirty bombs from China, radioactive strontium and cesium, in this stream, and how it went from microorganisms to algae, to fish that ate the algae, to the frogs that ate this, and on and on. And we could see it increasing and biomagnifying. He knows that. Global warming, that in recent decades is due to a great concentration of gases, CO2, methane, this. I want to say a bit about this. One of the disservices that I think much of the press has done to this encyclical, and has caused probably a polarization among many of us, even in the Catholic community, is its focus on the lightning rod of climate change and global warming. That's a disservice. There are 17 paragraphs that deal with the destruction and the crisis that we have in the earth. 3 of the 17 are devoted to climate change and global warming. There are 246 paragraphs in these 80 pages, and only 3 deal with global warming and climate change. But again, that's controversial. It becomes, all of a sudden, Francis meddling into the controversial issue of global warming. Bleaching and destruction of coral reefs. Millions of species affected by the temperature rise and pollution. Deforestation that actually leads to less carbon dioxide being removed from the climate and from the air. And he does point out so many forests cut, all become land, all for agriculture, and we've reduced our ability. The earth is not allowing us to give what she has within her. Acidification of the oceans is a big one. Again, due to carbon dioxide absorption, that we know from science, much science, that it affects the marine ecosystems, the marine food chains, and those ecosystems. Major losses in biodiversity, living organisms going extinct. We've got that documented. It's not questionable science. Acidification is not questionable. Water loss, decrease in availability and quality worldwide. Water is going to be the next frontier, probably for global tension, the lack of it. Drinkable water is a basic universal human right, Francis tells us, and it's a condition for the exercise of all other human rights. Take away water and we're in trouble. We're mostly water, you know, and all organisms on the earth are water-based. All organisms on the earth are carbon-based, which comes from the CO2 in the air through the plants, organic molecules, food, and us. So you start messing with that in a relationship, and you really have a crisis. And this is what he's telling us. And then air pollution from the burning of fossil fuels. Independent of warming. We have polluting, he says, especially coal, also oil, lesser degree, gas needs to be progressively replaced with gas needs. So that we're putting actually even nano-sized particles into the air that are breathed. And the Center for Disease Control, the World Health Organization, that's all that pointed out that this is a major cause of health problems from the burning of this, and he knows it as well, as does his scientists. Okay, so that's laid out. Good science behind it. The Pontifical Academy of Scientists is very good at this, and except for climate change, there's really no controversy about this. However, he has to link it to interrelatedness and interdependency to the church's social teaching. And how? Well, first, because all of these disproportionately affect the poor, living in vulnerable environments. The water availability, linked to water-related diseases, infant mortality. Because they all lead to a decline in quality of human life, breakdown of society. 43 to 47 in the encyclical is really a powerful piece there. A nice piece of literature that I really recommend. And the global inequality that is a constant theme of all of the social encyclicals. From Pope Leo XIII, Rerum Novarum in 1891, all the way through the popes. The social dimensions include the effects of technological innovations on employment, social exclusion, inequitable distribution of energy and other services, increased violence, and a rise in new form of social aggression. Here the social scientists come in. And the other Pontifical Academy is the Pontifical Academy for Justice and Peace. And that interacts with the with the scientific, the Pontifical Academy of Science. And he does a fairly good job, I think, very good job, in that 46th paragraph. So again, the social teachings. A true ecological approach always becomes a social approach. And then he is lyrical in this, almost Umbrian, to integrate questions of justice, debates, and environment as to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. He never stops. He never stops interrelating that and showing the interdependency. All living things have a value of their own in God's eyes. By their mere existence, they bless Him and give Him glory. That's from the Catechism. Catechism also clearly and forcibly criticizes the distorted anthropocentrism, where humans are the center of the universe. But each creature possesses its own goodness and perfection. Man must therefore respect the particular goodness of every creature to avoid a distorted vision of this. Again, the Catechism. The loss of species may constitute extremely important resources in the future. This is something that his scientists have pointed out, and we're all aware of, those of us that work in science. But also the popular notion of what do we get from animals and plants. Right now, the latest data that I saw, that 118 out of 150 of the most important pharmaceuticals that we have today come from living organisms. Plants, fungi, bacteria, even leeches. So it's no surprise that so much of this comes either directly from plants, animals, fungi, bacteria, or the structure, the molecular structure, is isolated and then synthesized in the lab. But we have a tremendous dependency, and he points out the more of these species we lose, the more we lose the possibility of important drugs. This is really important in the area of microorganisms and bacteria and fungi with respect to antibiotics, because we're becoming a society with diseases that are antibiotic resistant due to overuse of antibiotics. And to be able to find these, we depend upon these species. But when we poison the soil, we poison the microorganisms, and we compromise that ability. And sometimes you'll see something like a commercial. This was actually isolated from a jellyfish. Like a big surprise. Of course. Chapter 2 is devoted to the gospel of creation. Here he moves out of the scientific realm and the scientific level, but not the interrelationship, but he brings the gospel of creation. And we know the gospel of creation starts with Genesis. The creation accounts in the book of Genesis in symbolic and narrative language really teaches something profound. And this is one of his contributions that actually Pope John Paul has also noted, and Pope Benedict XVI. But this is unique to Francis, and I bold it. Genesis teaches us that human life is grounded in three fundamental and closely intertwined, interrelated interrelationships. With God, with our neighbor, and with the earth itself. He's bringing in our relationship to God and our neighbor, but you've got to include the earth because of our dependency, our interdependency on the earth. And according to the Bible, the three vital relationships have been broken, outwardly and within us. The rupture is sin. The harmony between Creator, humanity, and creation as a whole was disrupted by our presuming to take the place of God and refuse to acknowledge our creaturely limitations. And that is really what he's been trying to tell us. Benedict told us that. John Paul told us that in John the 23rd. And so he says, we're not God. The earth was here before us, given to us. And he points out that Christians have incorrectly interpreted the Scriptures. And we must forcefully reject the notion that our being created in the image of God and given dominion over the earth in Genesis justifies absolute domination over other creatures. Reject that business. Substitute stewardship. I've heard Father Paul talk about stewardship quite a bit. And that's what we're being called to do, is recognize the scriptural basis of a new interpretation of stewardship. The biblical texts have to be read in the appropriate hermeneutic. Recognize they tell us to keep and till. Keeping means caring, protecting, overseeing, preserving, not destruction. And not saying, we dominate the earth. It's given to us to dominate. And creation is the order of God's love, the fundamental force. This little throwaway piece here in 77 paragraph is developed so forcefully in chapter 6. It's not a throwaway. This God's love, fundamental force, it has such deep theological implications that go far back into Benedict's teaching, Benedict XVI, and even earlier. And here's Benedict. He reminds us from Benedict the destiny of the universe is the fullness of God, which is already attained in the risen Christ. The measure of maturity is. And Pope Francis acknowledges Father Teilhard de Chardin and Pope Benedict XVI. And the purpose of other creatures is not to be found in us. This particular line here is that all creatures are moving forward with us and through us toward a common part of arrival, which is God in that transcendent fullness where the risen Christ embraces and illuminates all things. We're called as humans to lead all creatures back to the Creator. This is anticipating, putting a little bit of seed of what's going to come in chapter 6. And this is where the theology gets very deep. Because as we have in the Eucharistic liturgy, the one that Father Paul read Sunday, the second one, all creation gives praise. Not creatures, not us, all creatures. And we're called to lead creatures back to the Creator. What that means requires a lot of reflection and a lot of study and really a different theology. Now, it's important that we not wander in this with the creatures and the importance of creatures, because one of the real red herrings in all of this is someone saying, you care more about the creatures than a baby that's aborted, or you care more about the creatures than humans? You're really elevating them here, Francis. What are you doing? He hits it right away in the middle of this chapter. This does not put all living beings at the same level, nor deprive human beings of their unique worth and tremendous responsibility. Nor does it apply a divination of the earth, which would prevent us from working on it and protecting its fragility. In other words, he's not wandering into New Age philosophy. He's telling us, no, be careful. This is not what this is about. It's not a divination of the earth. And we have people who take it that way in environmental extremism. And he's not an environmental extremist. So the Christian world, the destiny of creation, is bound up with the mystery of Christ, and quoting a very important piece of Scripture, Colossians 1:16 and 15 to 20. And when you read that, you say, how could we not see what Francis has been talking about before? When you really reflect upon those pieces of Scripture, those are so important to chapter 6. Chapter 3, what does he do here? The human roots of the ecological crisis. And here's where it's a lightning rod again. Oh, humans are causing all of this. Well, yes. What he's talking about, there are human-based technology in that. So he says here we're going to have to focus on the paradigm, technocratic paradigm, technology guiding us. Here he's saying that it becomes a epistemological paradigm. Epistemological is a belief system. And we in modern times believe that technology and science can solve all problems. It's the salvation here. We're so good in technology and science that we accept it then. It shapes the lives of individuals, a working society. And when you impose that particular technocratic paradigm, it leads to deterioration in the environment. One sign. So this chapter really delves into two driving forces that treat nature as devoid of spiritual or transcendental worth. And transcendental worth is chapter 6. These are the technocratic paradigm up here, and a modern anthropocentrism where humans are the end-all and the dominant species and determinant. Here he goes into what my friend Rod Stern and I talk about when we debate this, certain pieces of this. I call it the Darth Vader of the encyclical. There's a dark force running through the encyclical, and when you read it and you look at the references in the encyclical, you're going to see constant references to Romano Guardini, the end of the modern world, because our immense technological development has not been accompanied by development of human responsibility, values, and conscience. So Romano Guardini is a conscience. He's the conscience that reminds us of the dark side of all of technology and science. And that's a scary book to read. It's something to get through, but it is worth reading. He's a German scientist. This book is in German, but has an English translation. And it will really wake you up. Because, as Francis says, sure, we have nuclear energy now, biotechnology, information technology, IT, knowledge of our DNA, many other abilities we require. We have more power now, tremendous power, than the human race has ever had over our day. We can modify our genome. We can insert genes. We can create species. It's something, this power. But there's nothing to ensure it will be used widely when we consider how it's currently being used. And that is true. And that's the modern anthropocentrism he's talking about. So it prizes technical thought over reality. Francis keeps bringing us back to reality. he keeps reminding us what we're doing to Matre Terra. Sora Nostra Matre Terra. So, this misuse, when we fail to recognize the part of reality, worth of a poor person, a human embryo, person with disabilities, we're not able to hear the cry of nature itself because it's all connected. And we can't renew our relationship with nature unless we renew ourselves. There's a tendency to justify transgression of boundaries when the experiment is carried out on the human embryo. And the inalienable worth of a human being transcends his or her degree of development. A technology severed from ethics will not easily be able to limit its own power. And that's our Giordani again. He's right there. He's reminding us, we've got this power, but look how we're using that power. So Darth Vader is constantly the conscience here. Chapter 4, the integral ecology returns. And Pope Francis reminds us and reminds scientists that we're not dealing with two crises. One, the earth itself and the environment there, but one complex crisis which includes the social, the human, the social and the environmental. And he wants us to create a new humanism, a new way of looking at this. Now, there's a lot packed into this chapter, obviously. 4 is dense, but I've summarized it, and these are the key paragraphs. But let's get to them. He discusses in detail which problems does he believe that can only be addressed by an integral ecological approach. Remember, integral means sociological, it means economic, it means science, it means religion. All of these have to be intertwined to address these in integral ecological approach. So he said, lack of affordable housing. We sort of hear this, don't we, Sharon, in our bill. Deterioration of quality of life in the cities. We see that. Failure to see the relationship between human life and moral law. Consumers' vision of human beings. Heavy. A lack of understanding the principle of the common good. And then here is Francis. The risk of rampant individualism connected to a self-centered culture of instant gratification in today's postmodern world. And he, again, cites our old Bordini. Chapter 5 gives us hope. Francis does not leave us with what the end of the modern world might do. Giardini, he balances out Giardini a bit here by telling us that there is hope for this, and it's not too late, and there are lines of approach and action. Pope Francis, in his very beginning messages, said that he recognizes that not everybody agrees with his opinions, but they're really not his opinions. They're steeped in good science and theology. But he recognizes that that's the case. And he calls for an ecumenical approach. And he calls for dialogue. When we're talking to somebody about coal and maybe the destruction by mining of coal, we can't just, that's our position, and shut off the dialogue. We've got to listen, and we've got to understand where the other side's coming from. So this is a powerful thing in chapter 5, dialogue. Now we've outlined a major passive dialogue which can help us escape the spiral of self-destruction, which engulfs us. Dialogue in the international community. Here, the recent world summits. He says that businesses have been very slow to react to address these challenges in that paragraph. And a global consensus is needed because the problems cannot be solved by individual countries. That's why it has to be world dialogue, the world summits. And he goes through those from 164 to 168, summarizes what those world summits have told us. Second dialogue, for a new national and local policies. He said we really need this in our legislation. Dialogue and transparency in decision making. Again, 6 paragraphs. Politics and economy in dialogue with human fulfillment. Again, 9 paragraphs. Religions in dialogue with science. So important. Dialogue among the various sciences, since each can tend to be closed in their own language, which I know well, because we've done that. And as Barbara's illustration points out, we're connected, IT, we're connected so well across the world in a way that we've never been connected before. Father Teilhard de Chardin predicted that, and he said there's not only a geosphere and a biosphere, but there's a noosphere. And the noosphere over the earth is this: the interconnectivity and interrelatedness and interdependency of humans and human thought that we see in here. But old Giardini would tell us we misuse that as well. He'd be quick. The environment is one of those goods that cannot be adequately safeguarded or promoted by market forces alone. We need to reject the conception of the market which suggests that problems can be solved by increasing profits of companies or individuals. It's unrealistic to hope that those that are obsessed with maximizing profits will stop to reflect on the environmental damage which they will leave behind for future generations. We have so many examples of that it doesn't need to be even said. Profits alone count? Well, there can be no thinking about the rhythms of nature, facing decay, regeneration, complexity of ecosystems which are greatly upset by human intervention. Even the soil ecosystems are so affected by acidification and chemicals in this way. Just like an earlier slide that Barbara put in about the bee. You realize that there's sort of a global crisis with the decline of bees. Why is that important? It goes to what the canticle says about our sister Mother Earth. She brings us fruits and flowers of various kinds in that. There can't be fruits of many of our important crop plants and vegetables without pollinators. And now we've got such a lack of bees that people are now have a business. I don't know if you've seen it, TV's about it, carting around beehives to orchards where there are not enough bees that will pollinate to give us the apples and peaches. It's a crisis in that situation, and it's something we don't reflect upon enough. The interrelatedness and interdependency. Pollination is an interdependency that is enormous. So he's saying that really there hasn't been enough. The last chapter. Got about 2 minutes. And it's the toughest one. This is the ecological education and spirituality. He's calling for a change in lifestyle and a change in the way businesses operate using consumer power for boycotts. He knows what effect that's had in our society globally. He calls for a new type of environmental education, ecological education in various settings, in school, families, media, catechesis, elsewhere. Do we have it in our schools? Is it in our Catholic schools? He would stress the great importance of the family, which is the place which life, the gift of God, can be properly welcomed and protected. So the family, again, is the first repository, the place for ecological education. But so is catechesis, the media, the schools. Rod Stern and I talked about, is it in the schools? And if we have this discussion group, we'll go into this and see where we are in that. But then he goes deeper theologically, deeper and deeper. The sacraments are a privileged way in which nature is taken up by God. He's relating the sacraments to nature through St. Francis. They take us to a different and supranational plane. We're no longer on this ecological earthbound plane. They're taking us to the supernatural. All the creatures of the material world find their true meaning in the incarnate Word. The Son of God is incorporated in His person, part of the material world, planting in it a seed of definitive transformation. We'll probably spend a whole evening of an hour on that and what this means. The seed of definitive transformation. Now watch how he develops this. In the Eucharist. Eucharist is the center of this and the Mass. All that's been created finds its exaltation in the Eucharist, culmination of the mystery of the Incarnation. Through the fragment of matter, He brings us back into matter, into the earth. Fullness is achieved always, already, in the living center of the universe. Now here's where he goes into Franciscan theology. And one of your references, if you picked up the handout on references, if you really want to get into this, you must read the reference of the Franciscan nun, Ilia Delio. That is so key to understanding where Francis is going in this deep theological piece. Joined to the incarnate Son, presently enters the whole cosmos. He's taking us away from the earth and creation. Gives thanks to God. The Eucharist itself is an act of cosmic love. The Eucharist joins heaven and earth. It's in the Mass. It's in the gifts before we in the liturgy of the Eucharist. The very language. It embraces and penetrates all creation. All came from God's hands and returns to Him in adoration. Creation is, and here it is, creation is projected toward divinization, divinity, toward a holy wedding feast, toward unification with the Creator Himself. This is Pope Benedict XVI's homily, the Mass in Corpus Domini, and it's 236 in the encyclical. What does he mean by this cosmic Eucharist? And Mary, again we're going to come down to the earth itself, what we're made of, our carbon, our elements. Queen of creation cared for Jesus, now cares for the wounded world. Completely transfigured. She didn't go to heaven as a soul. She went to heaven in a material body, transfigured. Like Christ was transfigured on the mount. The transfiguration. And Peter was awed by this change in appearance. What is this transfiguration? She now lives with Jesus, carried into heaven, in her glorified body, together with the risen Christ. Part of creation has reached the fullness of its beauty. Francis hits it there. The corporal body, transfigured, is now going to be joined. And pointing out that we'll find ourselves ultimately face to face with the infinite beauty of God. Jesus, I'll make all things new. Revelations. But here, eternal life will be a shared experience of all, in which each creature, replenishedly transfigured, not just humans, will take its rightful place and have something to give to those poor men and women who have been liberated once and for all. So there's a transfiguration. And all creation gives you praise. But how? And as is pointed out in Ratio, Fides et Ratio, that encyclical of Pope St. John, we really have to use both of our intellect and we have to use our faith. And with one without the other is impoverished and enfeebled. They're interdependent. Again, the notion of interdependence. That ends this journey through Laudato Si. But we do have in our social outreach ministry, and this is something that Sharon brought, and now you'll bring to us, that there is something, an organization called the Catholic Climate Covenant, CCC, founded and endorsed by the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops and others. There's the opportunity for all parishes and dioceses to join this, but parishes especially. And one of the handouts that I have back there gives you information on that. If we do go forward with a discussion over the next year of Laudato Si, and believe me, we've only touched it, then we will bring in the Catholic Climate Covenant and a lot more information that we have about it. So that will be the end here. Thank you.